back with you here on News at Prime, and thanks for staying on. Government corruption, ghost workers, fake qualifications and matric group cheating has shown that no sector is immune to graft in the country. This has resulted in calls for ethical leadership to be prioritized. For more on how we can turn things around, we're joined by Graduate Institute of Financial Sciences CEO Dr. Kershen Pillay. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. The question is, firstly, we have ethical political leadership, because somebody might say that is an oxymoron. But then the next part of that question is, can ethical political leadership restore public trust in political leaders?
Well, thank you for having me again. And I think it's a complicated question. And as much as we say our political leaders, by and large, are unethical, there are those that are ethical, maybe few and far between, but there are those that are ethical. In addition to that, our private sector is not the only sector that is not free from unethical behavior and unethical conduct. So I think it's a twofold thing. But to answer your question, I would take us back to 30 years ago, when Tata Madiba said to us that the government that is going to come into place in the new democracy is going to be a people-centered society. And when we look at it, we do not have a people-centered society. We have a profit-centered society. And they say that money is the root of all evil, and that is what's happened. And we see it in the statistics of this. We have a Gini coefficient in our country, which is one of the worst in the world, where the people that have and the people that do not have, there's such a big gap between that. That's a telling sign. The second sign to it is Transparency International just launched a report which said South Africa scored 41 out of 100 in the corruption index. Maybe it's a pass in some aspects of education, but not in terms of what a democratic South Africa should be. So to answer the question, can there be some sort of fix for our country in terms of ethical leadership, but particularly with our politicians?
Yeah.
And the answer is anyone is able to change.
Right.
However, it takes deep introspection and accountability. And right now, accountability is lacking. And if we are able to gain accountability, then that's going to be something that would push ethical leadership forward. More so, Thabo, if you look at what's happening within the academic space and the business school space, there is a change in the framework of how business is done. Prior to this, it used to be about shareholder value proposition and profitability. Now it's moving to something that we call people, planet, and it was profit. It's now moved from profit to something called prosperity. So we are looking for the way business conducts itself is changing, because we have issues of climate change, global warming, etc., because of the selfish nature of people. And in order for our country to change, we need to adapt and discount all the bad habits that we have garnered over the years.
It's always said that people get the leaders that they elect. Now, leaders have such close proximity to the communities in which they serve. How is it then that those leaders, once they're in power, are unable to play an ethical role? In other words, they are people of their word. What they promise is what they deliver.
Thabo, I think it's a very difficult question to answer. But the reality of the situation, because it's a great question, but difficult, and I'll tell you why. It goes back to what happens. In a pre-democratic South Africa, there was a sense of ubuntu, a sense of community, where you looked after the people in your charge. Now leaders of today, once they get into power, they are looking at self-preservation, self-enrichment. And every decision that they make is not about protecting those in their charge, but rather, what's in it for me? And therein lies the biggest issue. We have gotten a sense of leadership, and we have a leadership crisis in this country because people have become selfish and they have lost their sense of community. If you had to think back in the days of when you were a child, you would be able to play in your community, but should you have done something wrong, anyone in your community could have reprimanded you because there was community involvement, community engagement. That sense of community is lost because everybody works in isolation. I want to look after my child. My child must go to the best school. My child must have this, or I must have that. There's no sense of community in the sense of everybody. And that's where we are lacking. People have become selfish. Leaders have become selfish.
But are people not also, in a sense, feeding into this? I'll tell you why. Because, I don't know how many people really vote for parties, because that's what we do in this country, based on their manifestos more than it is based on their emotional attachment. So they would put the issue of the promises maybe aside, but mostly want to vote for a leader based on the emotional attachment that they have to that particular person.
Thabo, again, brilliant question. It's what we as South Africans need to realize. We have become enamored with our politicians and our leaders. They have become individuals that are like celebrities and like demigods. But we must understand that our politicians are civil servants. They are here to serve their communities. And what we need to understand, and we need to look at it very, very critically and very clearly, is 30 years later, has my position changed? And that's how they need to be guided and make that decision. But unfortunately, again, critical thinking in our country is lacking because there is an educational deficit that's occurring. And we need to ask ourselves the question is, why is there so much of corruption within our education systems? Is it to prevent this critical thinking? Is it to prevent people from holding the leadership accountable? Is there a malfidi in place that is preventing people from being educated? Is there a bigger picture, or is there a bigger message that we are all missing?
Is there something that immediately within the realm, right, of the people that can be done? Because once again, the conundrum here is that the ball is in the court of the politicians. Yet again, we are relying on them to come up with the rules to end corruption. We are relying on them to make laws in parliament that are going to hold them accountable. Is there something outside of them that communities can do?
So, I hear what you're saying, and it reminds me of what Albert Einstein said. And Albert Einstein said that the world will not be destroyed by those that do evil, but those that watch and do nothing. So we must also understand that as the electorate, we have the power within us to hold those that are complicit and complacent accountable. So we need to have platforms like this. We need to encourage more dialogue on what it is that is ethical leadership. Because over the years, I think what's happened is South Africans have become despondent because there's a lack of accountability. And what we need to understand is that as a people, we are so strong in our numbers. As a people, together, we can make change. Because if we can create a democratic South Africa free of racism and oppression, we can definitely create a democratic South Africa that is free of corruption and the elitist individuals taking advantage of our most vulnerable in society. Because we need to remember that when we have conversations that matter and when we have dialogue on this, you know better and you educate it. And when you know better, you can do better. So I encourage leaders within their communities, like what we had in a pre-democratic South Africa, where communities used to caucus and talk about these issues. And they would lobby to ensure that these matters reach the place that they need to reach. Awareness within our communities need to be a thing that is critical at this point in time, especially for 2024, Thabo.
Dr. Kershen Pillay, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on, CEO of GIFTS there. Dr. Kershen Pillay.